Last time we spoke about the liberation of Mindanao. In the spring of 1945, as the battle for Okinawa intensified, American forces relentlessly confronted entrenched Japanese troops. General Buckner's 10th Army faced fierce resistance amidst some harsh weather and dwindling supplies. Despite these challenges, they captured the strategic Shuri Castle, marking a critical turning point as the Japanese troops retreated. Simultaneously, the liberation of Mindanao was underway. American troops under General Eichelberger rapidly advanced, overcoming fortified Japanese defenses in the mountainous terrain. With the 24th Division securing key locations like Digos and Davao, the 31st Division pushed northwards against General Monozumi's forces. Despite some stubborn resistance, American forces displayed tenacity and courage, leading to significant victories. By May the 20th, the Americans approached Malay, where remnants of the 30th Field Artillery Regiment held their ground. As Japanese troops attempted to regroup, they faced relentless assaults from the advancing American divisions. Throughout the campaign, the Americans endured heavy casualties, but their determination led to more than 10,000 Japanese losses. This episode is the North Borneo Offensive. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more. So give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And hey, after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over my YouTube channel, I just released a rather hilarious episode looking at how Japanese anime portrays the Pacific War. Honestly, I highly recommend it. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is 26 episodes and ongoing now, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The latest episode in the exclusive podcast series is on the USS Hornet CV-8, the entire history, everything that she did during the Pacific War, and it's going to be followed soon by the USS Hornet CV-12. As voted upon by my patrons. So if that's of interest to you, please go check it out. We're going to continue our story. It's June the 9th, and General Buckner's forces have pushed through the enemy's main defensive line on the Okinawa Peninsula. It was there that General Ushijima was preparing to make his final stand. Meanwhile, General Shepard's 6th Marine Division landed on the Oroku Peninsula, determined to dismantle a stubborn pocket held by Admiral Ota's naval units. On June the 10th, the pace of the assault quickened dramatically. Colonel Shapley's 4th Marines broke through enemy defenses, capturing the strategic hills of 58 and 55. At the same time, Colonel Roberts' 22nd Marines secured Hill 28 and 55's twin sister. Although Colonel Whaling's 29th Marines made only limited progress, they effectively identified the last significant pocket of resistance in the high ground west of Oroku Village. Looking south, General Duval's 1st Marine Division also reignited its offensive. Colonel Snedeker's 7th Marines successfully advanced into Itoman and Tera, while Colonel Mason's 1st Marines, supported by tanks, cleared the southern slopes of the key ridge between Tera and Yuza, capturing Yuza Hill in the process. Further east, General Bradley's 96th Division launched a renewed attack, bolstered by artillery and tank support. Colonel May's 383rd Regiment advanced approximately 700 yards towards the town of Yuza. Meanwhile, Colonel Halloran's 381st Regiment pushed into Unagasuku and Tomai. However, they faced fierce resistance, quickly encountering heavy machine gun fire originating from the heights of Yojudake, while they halted their advance. Meanwhile, General Arnold's 7th Division continued its relentless push towards Nakaza, employing the full might of their tanks and artillery. Colonel Finn's 32nd Regiment steadily advanced onto the eastern slopes of Hill 95, pressing towards Hanagasuku. At the same time, Colonel Patchler's 17th Regiment fought to solidify their precarious position in the southeast end of Yojudake. Back over at the sea, a kamikaze attack tragically sank the destroyer William T. Porter. That same day, Admiral McCain's Task Force 38 unleashed a barrage of bombs and artillery on Minami Daito Island, before retreating to Ledi Samar after 89 consecutive days off the coast of Okinawa. This marked the conclusion of their role in Operation Iceberg. The following day, the sustained pressure from Arnold's offensive began to fracture General Suzuki's 44th Independent Mixed Brigade on both flanks. Seas of flame engulfed Hill 95 on June the 11th, as the 1st Battalion of the 32nd Regiment slowly advanced towards the crest of the enemy position behind jets of armored flamethrowers. Flame fuel was pumped and sprayed from hoses over portions of the ridge inaccessible to tanks and then simply ignited. Infantrymen moved along the still hot and smoking rocks and drove back the surviving defenders. That night, the battalion dug in just short of Hill 95's peak. Although little forward progress was made by the 2nd Battalion of the 32nd Regiment or the 17th Infantry on June the 11th, the enemy position was considerably weakened. Intensive fire from supporting weapons was concentrated against the slopes of Yajudake, and strong patrols cleaned out the enemy groups that held positions near the 7th Divisional front lines. The 32nd Regiment achieved a significant victory by capturing the peak of Hill 95, while the 17th Regiment struggled to make further headway. To the west, advances in the 96th Divisional Zone were minimal, as Bradley's regiments focused on consolidating their newly won position amidst intense enemy fire. Simultaneously, at Yuza Hill, fierce counterattacks were thwarted, and Mason's 2nd Battalion accomplished the critical capture of Hill 69, just west of Ozato, despite heavy machine gun fire coming from Yuzadake. Further east, ahead of the 7th Marines, some 800 yards from the southern fringes of the two settlements lay, and I quote, "the scene of the most frantic, bewildering, and costly close-in battle on the southern tip of Okinawa, that being Kunushi Ridge." This precipitous coral escarpment constituted the westernmost anchor of the last heavily defended line of Okinawa. The ridge contained innumerable caves, emplacements, and tombs on both the forward and reverse slopes. The intervening area between this formidable fortress and the lines of the 7th Marines was a broad valley of grassy fields and rice paddies, which offered no protection to advancing infantry. The supporting tanks were restricted to two approaches into the position, a road across the valley which cut through the center of the ridge and another along the coastline. Both of these routes were covered by anti-tank guns. Shortly after noon, patrols from the 1st and 2nd Battalions moved out with armored support to probe the Japanese defenses. Intense frontal fire from Kunushi Ridge, enfilade fire from the enemy on Hill 69 opposing the attack of the 2nd Battalion 1st Marines, and artillery concentrations directed at the tanks forced a withdrawal at about 2:47. Because of the complete fire coverage of the open valley enjoyed by the Japanese, both from the heights and the slopes of the ridge itself and from Yasudake's area, it was apparent that daylight assaults on this position would be a costly affair. Consequently, after Colonel Snedeker had made a personal reconnaissance of the objective from a light liaison plane, it was determined that they would attack at night. The commanding officer of the assault battalions were oriented on the general plan during the afternoon. The central road and the line of telephone poles was designated as the boundary between battalions, upon which the assault units would guide. A scheme of maneuver contemplated a penetration of the ridge where the road passed through it, followed by an expansion of the initial foothold to the right and left flanks to secure the remainder of the objective in the regimental zone of action. Normal artillery would be placed alternately on Kunushi Ridge and Mezado Ridge, 500 to 600 yards southwest of Kunushi, until H hour, and thereafter on the latter. On June the 11th, General Shepard launched a concerted attack. The 22nd Marines successfully secured the Tomigusuki area and Hill 53, while the 29th Marines faced stiff opposition, making only limited gains against heavily fortified hills west of Oroku. Meanwhile, the 4th Marines worked to strengthen their line, completing the encirclement of Ota's naval forces. Nevertheless, the ramparts of the Oroku fortress were cracking, and Admiral Ota released his last dispatch to General Ushijima. "Enemy tank groups are now attacking our cave headquarters. The naval base force is dying gloriously at this moment. We are grateful for your past kindness and pray for the success of the army." During the night, artillery units successfully targeted and either killed or dispersed a group of Japanese troops attempting to cross the Kokuba River. Meanwhile, 51 infiltrators were eliminated as they tried to breach the lines held by the 22nd Marines. The following day, the 4th and 29th Marines intensified their efforts to compress the enemy pocket west of Tomigusuki, breaking through to seize Easy Hill while the 22nd Marines consolidated their positions. The capture of this key terrain feature forced the enemy into the alluvial flats along the coast between Oroku and Hill 53. It was said, quote, "In the late afternoon, enemy troops began displaying flags of surrender. Language officers equipped with loudspeaker systems were dispatched to the front-line areas to assist in the surrender of those Japs who desired to. The attempt was partially successful. 86 enemy soldiers voluntarily laid down their arms. For several days, General Buckner had been sending messages to the Japanese commander by radio broadcast and through airdrops pointing out the hopelessness of the enemy situation in an attempt to persuade General Usajima to surrender. During the afternoon of June the 11th, 10th Army representatives were conducted to the 2nd Battalion OP, overlooking Itoman, to await enemy parties that might desire to negotiate. At about 5 p.m., all fire was suspended in the 7th Marines area, pending the doubtful appearance of a white flag. About 15 Japanese wearing white headgear appeared in the 7th Marine zone in front of Company A. This was at about 5:40, but dispersed when hailed. 6 of the enemy surrendered to Company C at about 6:02, but the situation returned to normal 2 minutes later, when hostile mortar fire fell on the captor's position. Final orders for the resumption of the attack were issued by Colonel Snedeker at about 8 o'clock, setting H hour for 3:30 a.m. on June the 12th. Both the 1st Battalion and 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines were to make the assault with 1 company each. At about 2:25, Company C moved out to establish contact with Company F on the line of departure. The attack was launched on schedule at 3:30, and at 5 o'clock, Companies B and G moved out in support of the assault companies. Concurrently, Company F reached its objective at a point 500 yards north of Misato Village, as Company C came up on its left to extend the line eastward. The enemy was completely surprised, and several small groups were wiped out by Company C while they were engaged in preparing breakfast. At the same time, the 1st Battalion extended the line eastward towards Kunushi. However, the Japanese quickly regrouped, pinned down the attackers for the rest of the day, though the Marines managed to reinforce and consolidate their hard-won gains. By midnight, the positions there could be considered reasonably secure, but General Duval put it, "The situation was one of those tactical oddities of this peculiar warfare. We were on the ridge. The Japs were in it, both on the forward and reverse slopes." Elsewhere, the 1st Marines focused on mopping up Hill 69, dispatching patrols south through Osato, and maintaining their defenses on Yazoo Hill. To the east, another pre-dawn attack initiated by the 17th Regiment caught the defenders off guard. Colonel Patcher had compelling reasons for favoring a night operation. The defenders held a significant advantage in observation, which had posed serious challenges when the 3rd Battalion of the 17th Infantry seized the southeast end of the escarpment. The coral wall of the escarpment was particularly high at this end, and the narrow routes leading to the high ground were easily controlled by Japanese fire. After days of holding positions at the base of the 170-foot cliff, the troops had grown familiar with the terrain, and as their commander, Major Maynard Weaver, noted, they were eager to reach the top and finally see something new. The night attack was primarily planned for the 1st Battalion, but Colonel Patchler decided to coordinate a move to expand the territory held by the 3rd Battalion as well. The final plan involved 3 assault companies. Company A would occupy a cluster of coral about 100 yards beyond the edge of the escarpment, near the boundary between the 7th and 96th Divisions. Company B aimed for a similar objective located about 200 yards to the southeast, while Company L was assigned to capture a small hill situated between the 1st Battalion's targets and the positions held by the 3rd Battalions since June the 11th. Each company was given a separate route. Company A's path led straight up the cliff's face. Company B needed to head south to reach a break in the escarpment before turning right towards its goal, and Company L had an accessible objective near the edge of the escarpment. Movement was set to begin at 4 a.m. on June the 12th. Since the attack relied on stealth, no artillery preparation was planned. However, 2 battalions of 105mm artillery, 1 battery of 155mm howitzers, and an 8-inch howitzer battalion were scheduled to deliver heavy harassing fire during the night. Additionally, 21 batteries registered their fire on the afternoon of June the 11th. They were ready to provide protective artillery support if needed once the objectives were reached. For added firepower, a section of heavy machine guns was assigned to each assault company. Colonel Patcher meticulously planned the attack, ensuring that every soldier involved understood the details of the operation. Reconnaissance patrols had scouted the trails leading to the high ground, and demolition teams had already prepared known cave positions at the cliff's face with satchel charges. Despite thorough preparations, there was a collective apprehension about potential confusion caused by the unknown conditions of darkness. This anxiety was amplified at 8 p.m. on the night of June the 11th, when the 7th Division's G2 section intercepted an enemy radio message indicating, "Prepare to support the attack at 11 o'clock." Soon thereafter, another intercepted message stated, "If there are any volunteers for a suicide penetration, report them before the contact, which is to be made 1 hour from now." Meanwhile, from dusk until about 11 o'clock, the Japanese unleashed a heavy artillery barrage, leading frontline troops to anticipate a counterattack. That counterattack did come, aimed at the 1st Battalion of the 32nd Infantry, which had reached the summit of Hill 95 earlier that day, as well as against the 96th Division. However, there was no enemy activity observed in the 17th Infantry sector. As night illumination and harassing fire ceased shortly before 4 a.m., the attack proceeded according to plan. The companies moved out in single file. Remarkably, a heavy fog settled over southern Okinawa, creating the perfect conditions for concealment while allowing the troops to follow their paths without any confusion. On the high ground, Company A encountered a few civilians wandering about, while the leading platoon of Company B unexpectedly came across 3 Japanese soldiers as they reached the shelf of the escarpment. The Americans chose to ignore them and continued silently on their way, with the enemy surprisingly not opening fire. By 5:30 a.m., just minutes after dawn, Companies A and B were in position without firing a single shot. Company L also successfully reached its objective. Eager to capitalize on the fog and absence of enemy fire, its commander sent a support platoon to a small hill 50 yards beyond. This objective was secured quickly, but not without incident. 2 enemy soldiers were killed in the process. The platoon leader reported their progress but quickly called for mortar fire as about 50 Japanese troops approached in a column. The Americans opened up with rifles and bars, disrupting the formation and resulting in 37 enemy soldiers killed, while the rest managed to escape. The men of the 1st Battalion celebrated the success of the night attack. Shortly after Company A took its position, 4 enemy soldiers stumbled into view and they were swiftly eliminated. A few moments later, another 4 followed suit, meeting the same fate. Company B remained undisturbed until around 5:30 a.m., when Japanese soldiers attempted to emerge from several caves within the company's area. Although the cave entrances were heavily reinforced with concrete and couldn't be sealed with demolition charges, the Marines guarded the openings and shot at the Japanese as they appeared. Not long after daylight, Company C began clearing the caves at the base of the escarpment, eventually regrouping with the rest of the battalion on some high ground. At around 8 a.m., the situation had stabilized and the 17th Infantry held strong positions on Yajudake. During the night, the Japanese had withdrawn their frontline troops from Yajudake to escape the punishing artillery fire, intending to reoccupy it before the anticipated 7 a.m. attack. 15 hours after the 32nd Infantry fought their way to the top of Hill 95, the 17th Infantry had executed a masterful night attack to seize their portion of Yajudake. Throughout the day, the 2nd Battalion of the 17th Infantry relieved Companies I and K, and with Company L attached, supported by the medium and flame tanks, they continued their offensive. The 1st Battalion maintained its position, firing at some enemy soldiers who were slow to realize that their defensive terrain had been lost. Company B alone accounted for 63 Japanese soldiers killed throughout the day. Taking advantage of this breakthrough, the 381st Regiment advanced to occupy the slopes of Yajudake, while the 383rd extended their division front and secured Yuza. As the situation unfolded, Japanese troops maintained control over Big Apple Peak, which towered about 60 feet above the surrounding plateau. However, by the evening of June the 12th, the 7th and 96th Divisions had succeeded in forcing the reconstituted 44th Independent Mixed Brigade from the southeastern end of the enemy's line. General Ushijima acted swiftly, given the limitations imposed by his damaged communication system and the chaos amongst his frontline units. With his artillery nearly silenced by enemy bombardment and his supplies dwindling faster than his manpower, Ushijima's only hope lay in sending more troops into the relentless shell fire and flames unleashed by the American forces sweeping across the front lines. His urgent order read so: "The enemy in the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade sector has finally penetrated our main line of resistance. The plan of the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade is to annihilate, with its main strength, the enemy penetrating the Yajudake sector. The Army will undertake to reoccupy and hold its main line of resistance to the death. The 62nd Division will place 2 selected infantry battalions under the command of the CG 44th Independent Mixed Brigade." Unfortunately, the 64th Brigade, the part of the 62nd Division that had shifted from Shuri to reserve positions near Makabe, didn't receive this order until very late on June the 13th, a full 30 hours after it became critical. This piecemeal commitment of reserve troops proved to be grossly inadequate. By June the 13th, the 44th Brigade was teetering on the brink of destruction. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found the remnants of the 44th Brigade overwhelmed and absorbed into reinforcing battalions with still not enough men to hold the line. In a last-ditch effort, the enemy committed the main strength of the 62nd Division, his final reserve, with a desperate plea of cooperation and orders to, quote, reoccupy and secure the main line of resistance. However, by this time, the 62nd Division moved onto the line, and they ran headlong into General Hodges' forces who were advancing southward across the coral-studded plateau. The Americans pressed forward, shielded by fire of machine guns and tanks, advancing over the bodies of Japanese defenders who had fought fiercely to hold their last stronghold to the death. On June the 13th, General Arnold resumed his assault against the rapidly disintegrating 44th Independent Mixed Brigade. The 32nd Regiment successfully secured Hill 95 in the Hanagasaki area, while the 17th Regiment expanded its control over the escarpment summit. To the west, May's 3rd Battalion and Halloran's 2nd Battalion struggled to capture the top of the escarpment despite some repeated attempts. However, they significantly diminished the defenders' strength with a relentless volume of covering fire. At the same time, May's 1st Battalion advanced through Yuza and swept southward to successfully secure Osato. Meanwhile, General Deval prepared to commit the 1st Marines to fight on Kunushi Ridge, as the isolated 7th Marines continued to be pinned down by heavy Japanese fire, relying on tanks for supplies and evacuation. Further north, the 29th Marines launched an attack southeast to eliminate the enemy pocket, while Shapley's 3rd Battalion moved swiftly towards the beach, progressively chasing the demoralized Japanese forces from the thick brush and marshy terrain along the waterfront. As they reached the seawall, the assault turned into a rout. Some of the enemy threw down their arms and fled at the Marines' approach. Large numbers surrendered, but some fought back with hand grenades in desperation, individual last-ditch stands, while many more used grenades to simply destroy themselves in despair. The seawall was reaching at noon, and the remainder of the day was spent running to earth small groups hiding in cane fields and rice paddies. In the late afternoon, General Shepard notified General Geiger that all organized resistance on Oroku had ceased. In the early hours of June the 14th, Mason's 2nd Battalion advanced towards Kunushi Ridge, tenaciously fighting their way to positions east of the 7th Marines, which remained isolated. Simultaneously, Shepard's reinforced reconnaissance company successfully landed on Sinaga Island, completing the occupation of the Oroku Peninsula. Looking south again, May's 1st Battalion completed the cleanup of Osato, but soon had to withdraw from its vulnerable position, while the rest of the 383rd Regiment pressed forward to the edge of the escarpment west of Yajudake. To the east, despite heavy mortar machine gun fire, the 381st Regiment maintained constant pressure on the northern face of Yajudake, finally reaching the top of the escarpment by nightfall. Their success allowed them to link up with the 7th Division, which dealt a crushing blow to the 13th Independent Battalion, advancing approximately 300 yards across the front. After a night of disorganized counterattacks and infiltration attempts, the 7th Division launched an assault towards Hills 115 and 153, advancing about 1,200 yards and reaching the outer slopes of the hills' positions. To the west, the 381st Regiment and May's 3rd Battalion successfully secured the escarpment between Yuza and Yajudake, although the remainder of the 383rd struggled to move forward due to some heavy fire from Yasudake. On Kunushi Ridge, the pressure from the Japanese remained relentless, restricting the 7th Marines to only minor local gains. However, Mason's 2nd Battalion managed to inch its way along the ridge, successfully extending the line by about 200 yards to the east. Behind them, Colonel Griebel's 5th Marines began to relieve the weary 1st Marines, with Griebel's 2nd Battalion finally moving forward during the night to support Mason's isolated 2nd Battalion. On June the 16th, after intense bombardment of artillery, mortars, and rockets, the 7th Marines finally broke through. Snedeker's 1st Battalion advanced along the northern slopes of Kunushi Ridge, while the 2nd Battalion extended the line into the initial high ground of Mezado Hills Mass. Concurrently, Griebel's 2nd Battalion advanced, making slow but steady progress until they secured a coral peak on the ridge that commanded their position. To the east, the 62nd Division attempted to move from its reserve location southwest of Makabe to support the faltering Japanese lines, facing devastating fire from artillery, ship guns, and aerial bombardments of rockets and napalm. Seizing the opportunity created by relentless bombardment of the enemy rear areas, Bradley launched his battalions through the Yasudake perimeter. Colonel Dill's 382nd Regiment pushed through the 383rd and advanced towards Osato, aiming to gain control over the high ground southwest of Yuza, while May's 3rd Battalion successfully captured Yuzadake. Additionally, the 381st Regiment gained approximately 600 yards along its front, reaching the saddle between Yuzadake and Hill 153. Meanwhile, the 17th Regiment pressed onto the forward slopes of Hill 153, and the 32nd Regiment, driving down the coast, took Hill 115, effectively eliminating the 15th Independent Mixed Regiment. Back at sea, despite a significant depletion of Japanese air strength, a kamikaze attack succeeded in destroying the destroyer Twigs. But now it's time to leave Okinawa and turn our attention to Borneo, where we continue covering the Australian offensive. As we last left off, by May the 6th, Brigadier Whitehead's 26th Australian Brigade had successfully landed on Tarakan, pushing the Japanese garrison into the island's rugged interior. By the evening of May the 6th, fairly copious information obtained from prisoners and Indonesians and from captured documents indicated that the enemy had about 390 naval troops in Mount Api's area, about 400 troops and civilians in the Fukukaku headquarters, 200 from Sassanip along Snags Track and Otway, 300 on Otway and in District 6, 300 in the Amal River area, and 60 at Cape Juanta. Having lost the airfield and the water purifying plant and hospitals, the enemy at this time was displaying a decided disinclination to hold ground. In particular, he was shunning any ground which could be subjected to heavy bombing, shelling, or attacks by tanks, or against which large-scale attacks could be launched by our troops. The enemy was also directing his operations to delaying the attackers, particularly with mines, booby traps, suicide raids, and isolated parties fighting to the death in tunnels and dugouts. The 4th Company of the Tokai Force of the Imperial Japanese Army, plus the 1st Company of the 2nd Naval Guard Force, were on Hill 105. The 1st Company of the Tokai Force and other troops were also on Hill 102. In the north was a other composite group. To secure the recently captured airfield from potential counterattacks, raids, and indirect fire, Brigadier Whitehead decided to deploy the 2nd and 48th Battalion to gain the high ground north of the town, reaching up to Snags Track. The 2 and 4th Commando Squadron was tasked with advancing along Snags Track towards the Sassanip oil fields, while the 2 and 3rd Pioneers were assigned to sweep the high ground east of the town and move along John's Track to the mouth of the Ama River. Meanwhile, the Dutch Company was to clear the unoccupied Cape Batu Peninsula, a task that proved surprisingly straightforward. In the Mount Api area, however, the 2 and 23rd Battalion faced fierce resistance, particularly at Tiger and along Crazy Ridge, resulting in minimal progress until they were relieved by the 2 and 24th Battalion on May the 9th. Further to the right, the 2 and 48th Battalion seized Otway without opposition, and the commandos successfully cleared Snags Track up to Highs by May the 8th, though tanks could not advance any further. The Pioneers, on the other hand, encountered heavy resistance along John's Track, which they couldn't overcome until May the 9th. That day, a long-distance patrol from the 2 and 24th Battalion also succeeded in driving the Japanese out of the Jata oil fields after a brief skirmish. On May the 10th, while the 2 and 48th and the commandos patrolled aggressively forward, the Pioneers began their assault on the heavily defended Helen Feature, which would successfully repel repeated Australian attacks for the next 5 days. Simultaneously, the 2 and 24th faced strong resistance in the Mount Api area, but tenaciously pushed forward to Hill 105 on May the 11th, capturing Tiger the following night. They conducted patrols that probed about 1,000 yards southeast, cutting Snags Track at several points. On May the 12th, the 2 and 48th set out to cut King's Track and clear the heights from Sykes to Butch. The next morning, they successfully attacked and captured the knoll north of Snags Track. Meanwhile, following a highly effective air bombardment, the key Helen Feature was found abandoned on May the 15th. This allowed the Pioneers to clear John's Track and reach the coast at the mouth of the Amal River. Concurrently, the commandos secured the Agnes Feature, followed by the 2 and 24th Battalion's capture of Elbow on May the 16th. The remaining positions on Hill 105 were then subjected to intense bombing and bombardment, leading to an Australian assault on the 19th. They finally captured the feature the following day. In the meantime, the 2 and 48th Battalion moved to Agnes to attack Frida on May the 14th. It was now evident that if Frida Hill was to be taken, the attack must have heavier support. Therefore, on May the 22nd, 12 Liberators at 12 Lightnings were sent out to bomb and use napalm, but the clouds were so low that some of the heavy bombers did not find their objective. Then the artillery and mortars fired, and a 2-company attack went in, the infantry moving very close behind the barrage. Gooden's company thrust from the east, and Captain Nicholas's advanced from one platoon pushing east along Snags Track towards Track Junction Knoll, and another pressing north. The former platoon, led by Lieutenant Harvey, moved through some very difficult country along a razorback, so narrow that only 2 men could be deployed on it, edging forward under heavy fire after losing 1 killed and 4 wounded, and finding the enemy becoming stronger. Harvey maneuvered out of this position. It was then found that a wounded man was not with them, so Harvey and 3 volunteers thrust back and engaged the enemy fiercely while the wounded man was carried out. During the day, Gooden's company on the right hand encountered 2 strongly held knolls. Derrick's platoon succeeded in cutting the saddle between them and taking one knoll. Derrick's platoon and another launched a most courageous attack up the steep slopes of knoll number 2 in the fading light. Here, in some of the heaviest and most bitter close-in fighting of the whole campaign, was performed by 2 platoons finally reaching the top and securing the knoll after inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy. Lance Sergeant Fennels, time and time again, crawled ahead of the attacking troops, even within 5 yards of the enemy, and gained vital information. On one occasion, when his section was forced to the ground, he charged the Japanese position with his Owen gun blazing and had silenced the enemy post, killing the occupants. In a similar manner, Private W.R. Howe found the advance of the troops checked by a well-sighted pillbox. He raced forward with his Owen, firing until within grenade range, and then throwing grenades, moved in for the kill, until he was wounded. He had silenced the post and killed the machine gunner, thus allowing the advance to continue. At this stage, 28 enemy dead had been counted, 1 Australian had been killed and 15 were wounded. Unfortunately, the Japanese counterattacked the following day, effectively recapturing the position. Following a devastating combination of air and artillery bombardment, the Australians managed to secure Flida and the Track Junction Knoll on May the 25th. During this time, the 2 and 23rd Battalion remained in close contact with the resolute enemy at Janet and Margie, but struggled to make significant progress. The 2 and 24th Battalion continued probing northward and captured the Drup feature on May the 26th. After another failed attack on the 29th, a heavy air and artillery bombardment supported by the 2 and 23rd allowed them to finally capture Margie on May the 31st. Concurrently, the 2 and 24th successfully attacked and held the Poker Hills. On June the 1st, the 2 and 48th Battalion then attacked Hill 102, supported by aircraft and machine gun fire. Lieutenant O'Rourke's platoon attacked, following an artillery barrage as closely as they could, bringing with them a lot of flamethrowers. They gained the forward slopes without being fired on and saw 5 Japanese moving towards them, evidently to re-enter the positions after the bombing. These were fired on while the flamethrowers were brought into action. One operator sprayed the slope from side to side while another fired straight up it. As said to us by O'Rourke, "The result was devastating. The hill was set completely ablaze to a depth of 50 yards. 2 of the 5 Japs were set on fire, and the other 3 were killed in their posts. The platoon was able to advance almost immediately through the flames, and with the help of the flamethrowers, the feature was completely captured within 15 minutes of the advance commencing. The flame, which was fired up a slight rise, hit the trees on the crest and also sprayed the reverse slope. It had the effect of completely demoralizing the enemy. While the Australians launched an unsuccessful assault on Wally, the 2 and 23rd Battalion was engaged in clearing out the remaining Japanese forces from Margie and its surrounding areas. On June the 6th, the Australians finally secured Wally, and the 2 and 24th Battalion also managed to capture Roger. In the early hours of June the 10th, the Japanese launched a counterattack towards Hill 105, but it was easily repelled. At the same time, the defenders began preparing for a withdrawal northeast into the island's interior, planning to split into independent groups to wage guerrilla warfare. Despite the looming withdrawal, Whitehead's battalions commenced attacks on Beach 2, Joyce, and Linda on June the 11th. However, progress was slow over the next 3 days, with the only notable achievement being the capture of Sandy on the 13th. By nightfall that day, the Japanese finally began to withdraw, leaving behind only rearguards to hold the crucial Essie track. This allowed the Australians to capture the abandoned features of Linda, Joyce, Clarice, Hilda, Patty, Mellon, and Auntie on the 14th. The next day, the Australians took Nellie and Faith, but the Japanese rearguard on Essie Ridge managed to temporarily halt their pursuit. Eventually, however, Essie Ridge was overrun, and by the 16th, Fukukaku was cleared. The 2 and 48th Battalion then pursued the Japanese as they fled eastward from Essie. On the 18th, they caught a few, but found that a large group had scattered into smaller parties. By the 19th, patrols were radiating east, north, and west in pursuit, with Japanese forces standing firm at several points. Ultimately, the fall of Hill 90 on the 20th of June marked the end of organized resistance on Tarakan. Following this victory, Whitehead initiated a mop-up operation that would continue until the war's end. While the 26th Brigade was fighting to secure Tarakan, General Wooten's 9th Australian Division was preparing to launch the invasion of Brunei Bay and the area north of Borneo, codenamed Operation Obe 6. At the Manila Conference in April, General Morshead had learnt that Obe 1, that being Operation on Tarakan, and Obe 6, North Borneo, and Obey 2, Balikpapan, were to be carried out in that order. 34 LSTs would be allotted to Obey 6, but would need to be released by 23 days after the landing. There were other fairly severe restrictions on the vessels that were available. The 1 boat battalion of the American Engineer Boat and Shore Regiment and the 1 amphibian tractor battalion allotted to Obey 6 had to be used for Balikpapan. Morrishead and his staff arrived back to Morotai from Manila on April the 21st, and the next day the Corps issued its staff study of the North Borneo operation, and the 9th Division staff, which from April the 4th to the 17th had been planning an operation against Balikpapan, began preparing an outline plan for the attack on Brunei Bay instead. This was presented to the Corps and approved on the 26th of April. The final plan, which contained no major changes, was approved on May the 16th. Meanwhile, a variety of problems had arisen at the Corps level and above. On May the 1st, 2,200 troops and about 1,200 vehicles, including a lot of guns, of the 9th Division were still in the Cairns and Atherton areas awaiting shipment. And some of the stores and equipment were not scheduled to arrive at Morotai until about May the 25th, 2 days after the proposed date of the landing. It also appeared that on the day of the landing, the 24th Brigade would lack some unit stores and vehicles, and the 20th Brigade would possess only 1 battalion. There would be no field or anti-aircraft guns, there was a shortage of signal vehicles and equipment, no equipment for building wharves and bulk oil storage, and neither of the casualty clearing stations allotted would be present. Due to a series of issues at the Corps level and above, the invasion plan had to be scaled down to a landing by a brigade on Labuan Island and just a battalion on Murray Island, with the operation further postponed until June the 10th. The strategy involved landing Brigadier Selwyn Porter's 24th Brigade on Victoria Harbour's Brown Beaches to capture the Labuan airfield and eliminate all the hostile forces on the island. Simultaneously, Brigadier William Windier's 20th Brigade would put ashore the 215th Battalion on Murray Island at her White Beach and the 217th Battalion on Brunei Bluff's Green Beach. These units were tasked with capturing Brookton and securing the southern and western sides of Murray Island, setting the stage for an advance on Brunei Town. Upon capturing these objectives, the 9th Division was to occupy and defend Brunei Bay, Beaufort's area, and take control of the Miri, Lutong, Seraya regions. Once again, Admiral Barby's naval attack force, primarily comprising Admiral Royal's transports and Admiral Berkey's cruisers, was designated to facilitate the amphibious movement of troops to the Brunei Bay area. In preparation for the invasion, American and Australian air forces under General Kenny's command targeted airfields and other military installations, focusing particularly on destroying bridges on the railway to Jesselton to prevent the arrival of reinforcements to Labuan by rail. On June the 4th, Barby's convoy finally departed Morotai, embarking on its 1,100-mile voyage to Brunei Bay. Air attacks intensified on June the 5th, successfully rendering the Papa River Bridge unusable. 4 days later, on June the 9th, the air campaign reached its peak, with 54 Liberators and 24 Mitchells launching strikes against targets on Labuan, while 23 Liberators targeted the Brookington area. In the meantime, minesweepers successfully cleared a channel into the bay, destroying 69 mines between the 7th and 9th of June. Berkey's cruisers sailed ahead and shelled the brown, white, and green beaches in the 2 days leading up to the landings. The convoy finally arrived at the main channel between Labuan Island and Brunei Bluff just before sunrise on the 10th, fully prepared to execute the invasion. Opposing them was General Baba's 37th Army, which had assembled General Nozaki's depleted 56th Independent Mixed Brigade into the Brunei Bay sector. This included 2 battalions near Brunei, 1 at Beaufort, and 1 garrisoning Labuan. Additionally, the 553rd Independent Battalion was stationed in the Miri area. However, none of these units were equipped to make a stand at the beaches. At 8:15 a.m., Barby's warships commenced a bombardment of the southern beaches as the troops were loading onto their landing vessels. Shortly after 9:05 a.m., the first waves began to advance, preceded by craft firing rockets and artillery. As anticipated, there was no opposition on the landing areas. The 215th Battalion successfully reached the shore at about 9:15, followed by the 217th Battalion, which made landfall 3 minutes later, approximately 1,000 yards east of its intended location. By dusk, the 215th had scoured the swampy terrain of Murray Island and reported no Japanese presence. The 217th pushed forward a few miles along the road to Brunei, while the 213th Battalion landed and moved into reserve behind the 217th. Meanwhile, the 228th Battalion landed without any incident at 9:15 and quickly secured Labuan town, with the 243rd Battalion falling ashore at about 9:20 to initiate the advance towards its airfield. There was no opposition until about 10:45 a.m., when the leading troops came under rifle fire just south of Flagstaff Hill. This post was quickly bypassed and taken, but the Australians continued to face strong resistance from the 371st Independent Battalion. Despite this, the defenders could not prevent the 243rd from capturing the airfield by nightfall. During the day, Porter also landed the 211th Commando Squadron on the unoccupied Hamilton Peninsula, with one troop initiating a move north along Charlie Track. On the 11th, while the 243rd patrolled north and west, overcoming some opposition, the 228th slowly advanced towards Able and Baker routes, where they encountered the bulk of the enemy resistance. Meanwhile, after repelling an enemy patrol overnight, the 217th continued its advance to Brunei unopposed, with a company from the 215th moving up the Brunei River to land about 4 miles downstream from the town. The following day, the 217th reached and seized the airstrip, finally encountering defenses manned by the 366th Independent Battalion. At Labuan, the 243rd moved unopposed to Hamilton Road and successfully linked up with the commandos, leaving behind one company and 3 tanks to destroy a bypass stronghold to the northwest. At the same time, the 228th probed the strongly held area astride MacArthur Road and to its west, making good progress to compress the resilient enemy into a pocket. On the 13th, although the 243rd occupied an emergency airstrip and Timbalai, the primary objective remained to continue compressing the enemy into said pocket, and to mop up the remainder of the island. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. If after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Australian troops under Brigadier Whitehead landed on Tarakan, swiftly overcoming Japanese strongholds. By May the 20th, they began the North Borneo Offensive, achieving significant territorial gains amidst some brutal combat. As Japanese forces faltered, some surrendered, signaling a turning tide. The campaign showcased immense courage and sacrifice, with heavy casualties on both sides, ultimately paving the way for Allied victories in the Pacific theater.